This is the session on targeting and also on impact evaluation. And what we're going to do is the following, that I'll give a very intuitive but non-technical just overview so you have an idea of what approaches to targeting are, but not teach it in any depth, just because I think some of people were interested in the targeting processes. But there are papers you can look at and other materials. And then Anna will go through impact evaluation. If we have time before tea, I'll also take 10 minutes to take you through the OPHI website and the resources that you can download on the International MPI. We're hoping that we'll have time before the tea break to do that. Yeah. How many of you are working on targeting? Or have worked on it? Okay. Some, but not a lot. So I just want to basically sensitize you to the data needs and the different data considerations on a targeting measure. But the aim of a targeting measure is first to identify poor people relatively accurately. And to identify each person, whether or not they should be targeted, you need data for each person. And so the most basic point of a targeting instrument is that you cannot use a nationally representative sample survey because it has data over 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000 people. And so you need a different kind of data instrument, a census. And in order to use a census where you have a data point per household or per person, the questionnaire or the census instrument is going to be different than a survey instrument because it has to be affordable, so it has to be shorter than your normal survey. The questions have to be accurate or verifiable. We'll go through each of these in a moment, and not create perverse incentives for people. So there are different considerations when you move to a census instrument that is going to be used for targeting. Additional considerations of verifiability and of incentives than there are when you are simply using national survey data. And a lot of the differences and the art, in a sense, of creating good targeting measures has to do with how you use those census data accurately to identify who is poor. Now, there's divided opinion as to whether the methodology used for targeting needs to be totally transparent. In Oportunidades in Mexico, or Progresa, one of the early conditional cash transfer programs, they did not make public the weights or the methodology that they used to target people. They were afraid that if they did, people would not be honest in the surveys and they would try to adjust their responses. In another context, for example, in India, where they are talking about targeting below the poverty line, BPL households, and have been in several different waves through time, the measure is explicit, and it's deliberately explicit because that enables local communities to triangulate and to verify whether or not the right people are being targeted. So there's a difference of view and there's a difference in practice as to how explicit the methodology that you use to identify who should be a beneficiary should be. Okay, so how do you use an MPI or a multidimensional measure that is based in nationally representative survey data to inform a targeting exercise, where the objective of that exercise is to use a census instrument to target the people who are multidimensionally poor as recipients or beneficiaries of particular interventions. This could be individual or household level targeting. So just to very clearly, first of all, you need to figure out who is poor. And for our purposes, we're going to presume that the MPI identifies who is poor accurately. And then you are going to target the people from a census instrument who are as poor as great of an overlap with the poor population as possible. It won't be perfect. So for example, if 40% of people are multidimensionally poor, then maybe you can target 30% of them by your measure. But then you'll have other groups that are either poor but not targeted on this side, or non-poor but targeted. And so clearly the 30% are the group that overlap, where both measures agree who is poor at the identification stage. And then there are a group of undercoverage and a group of leakage, in these very technical terms that are used in the literature. And your aim very clearly is to minimize the undercoverage and the leakage. So to try to get the identification of who is poor as close as possible. And because you're using different survey instruments, it's a different approach in terms of justifying the parameters, if that's your aim. So just to start from where we are in the literature, most targeting measures use one of a variety of different proxy means tests. And one of the useful things in that literature is that they have paid a lot of attention to the scope and the size of these undercoverage and leakage errors of inclusion and errors of exclusion. And they tend to be quite sizable. For example, Grosh and Baker find that the undercoverage and leakage rates in urban Jamaica was 43% and 26% when they needed a targeting measure. And there were others this was an urban study in Bolivia and in Peru. But there are quite high rates of undercoverage. The denominator here is of the poor people, or of the population. And another study in Sri Lanka, and there are many studies of the proxy mean tests. And that is, in a sense, one of the motivations. It's at this stage, an early stage in the development of the methodologies. But the question is whether using a multidimensional measure, you would be able to improve the match, so decrease the leakage and the undercoverage. I'm going to discuss it where you're improving the match to a multidimensional poverty base indicator. Of course, you could try to improve the match to a monetary base indicator as well, using a counting-based approach instead of a proxy means test approach. So here are some papers that we've drawn on. I haven't, because of time, I'm not going to give you any empirical examples, just the basic ideas. But if you are interested, they're all on the OPHI website, and you can access versions of them there. And there's a lot more work in progress in different contexts, practically as well as academically. So the proposal is that the targeting method is going to proxy the identification of the poor where it's done with a national measure. But there's another reason, of course, to target or try to track a national measure. The national measure will be used to observe trends in poverty. And if you are targeting the poor, and if you succeed in your interventions in addressing their poverty, then hopefully you will have affected this national MPI, and it will go down. And so in a sense, there will be an imperfect but interlinked monitoring relationship between the MPI and some interventions. Won't be perfect, won't be establishing causality, but at least it would look at trends. And we've already looked about the construction of a national MPI, and I won't go into that again. I'm just presuming that we have constructed it to reflect both normative and policy priorities. And so the national MPI, in a sense, becomes your anchor measure. And in a sense, the first circle I showed of who are the poor, we're going to use the identification method. And so it has to be accurate for the national MPI if you're going to use it to try to structure another measure. And so you may need qualitative work, you may need other kinds of triangulation to verify that the identification of the national MPI is accurate and there are not poor groups that are excluded, type 1, type 2 errors in the national MPI itself. But right now we're taking that as given, and so we're going to use it as what I call an anchor measure. That is the measure that most accurately identifies who is poor. And also is analyzed over time and by subgroups. So what you will then do is construct a second MPI. So for these purposes, I'm presuming you'll use an M0 measure, which is appropriate for ordinary and binary data, which is most often available on the censuses. And that you will use a counting-based construction that we've been discussing. But you'll construct a different MPI targeting, T, to identify the target population. What is different in this case is that for national MPI, you justify the parameters normatively. But in the targeting measure, you are going to dial up and down the parameters to make the fit with the identification of the national measure as tight as possible. So you don't, in a sense, only need a normative justification. You also need to look at the fit with the national MPI and who they've identified as poor. In order to do this, the piece of information you need when you're designing a targeting measure is some database which has the survey data that are used for the national MPI, or the anchor measure if that's not a national MPI, and the instruments on the census. So for example, when Shumon Set and I worked on the India case, we didn't exactly have the census questions in the database that we were using, and there are certainly limits of what you can do if you don't have all of those available. Now, a word on the census schedules that are used for targeting. They are going to be simpler because they need to be appropriate to go to scale, and the enumerators may not be as trained as the NSO, National Statistics Office, National Statistics Bureau enumerators. For example, you may not want to use malnutrition because getting child malnutrition data requires not only equipment, but also training of how to weigh a squirming baby. How to measure the length of a squirming baby, and other things. They have to be shorter. They can't be a 45 or a 1 hour questionnaire. And so, for example, instead of getting the education data for everybody in the household roster, you might say, what is the highest educational level of any of the household members? Or you might, in other ways, try to summarize or distill the information that you most need, the education of the household head, depending on how you are designing the measure. A third is, John Hammack mentioned yesterday, it's nice to be honest, but sometimes if people realize that they are being asked questions in order to be identified as recipients of certain subsidies or benefits, then they might want to tell you the answer that will get them those benefits. So if you say, does anybody in your household have, or what's the highest level of education, and they know if they said 10th class, they won't be eligible, then they'll say 5th class. And so often it's useful if the indicators are verifiable. That is, it's something that you can see instead of asking how much income do you have, where we know even in survey instruments that there is underreporting. A question about a house where you are asking a question inside the house is a little bit more verifiable. My ceiling is dirt, but your ceiling is concrete. You can see it. And in some cases also speaking with neighbors or others. And the fourth consideration is that you may need to think about incentives. For example, if one of the benefits of a government program is providing a latrine, but a household that already has a latrine is not eligible not only for that program but for many other programs, then the household might not want to accept that particular intervention if they know that if they simply accept that, they will be excluded from other benefits they might want. And so thinking about the incentives that people will have to take up or not take up some intervention that would be good otherwise in terms of their lives and poverty status is important. So it's just to say that when it comes to the census which is used for targeting, there are considerations of cost, accuracy, and the human resource base, but there are also considerations more about people's own incentives to respond and to adopt services. And you need to think of all of those, or the people who are designing this will already think of all of those, but you using the data will then observe that the questions are considerably different. And so here are some examples. You may, therefore, in the measure, use a proxy variable. In India, it's very well known that the scheduled tribe group tends to be much poorer than other groups. it's relatively easy to verify or to know the scheduled tribe classification. And so rather than having a classification like, your income, you might want to look at the data from other surveys and recognize that 90% of people of this particular social group are poor in the relevant sense, whether it is of this indicator, whether it is income or whether it is something else, and so use that variable as a proxy for deprivation. Now there's a problem with doing that, because the problem is what happens in 10 years' time at the trends. A person will not change a socioeconomic variable over 10 years, and so you can't use this for looking at trends over time. And you'll have to always update the verification that it is still a proxy of that underlying indicator that you're using it for. But quite often these indicators are used. Another proxy could be if the person was divorced. However, you have to be careful that you don't make incentives for people to break up their marriages so they can obtain benefits. So these are a little bit more complex, but using these proxy variables will be very common in targeting instruments. There's also, but because of it, the real emphasis of a targeting measure is identification, and maybe therefore not on measuring trends over time. And maybe that's why you have your national MPI with better data that will reflect the trends in time in the underlying indicators that you're proxying using simpler indicators. So I already said, to design an instrument, ideally you'd have a data set that included both the sample and the census questions, and that also adequately reflected the diversity of different groups where you might, because the targeting or the parameters might differ for different groups across societies. And you would also need the national MPI or the anchor measure specifications, both to identify who is poor individually, but also to establish different levels of poverty across the country. And we'll talk about that separately. I need to finish in 5 minutes, but I will. So when you have these tools, then you can put together targeting measures, and basically they have one, two, or a combination of types. Either they exclude people who are clearly non-poor and leave the rest. So if you have a Mercedes, if you have a 6-room house, if you pay income tax in this bracket, you might be excluded, and it might be universal otherwise. However, another option is to say you are only included if you fit these different criteria. Your housing is a poor level, your education is a poor level, you have some food insecurities, and your geographic reference is one of deprivation in terms of services. Or you can use both. And there's a very good paper by Gendrez and Rita Kakera thinking through the way that both of those criteria can be combined and how the stringency of the identification changes in different ways of combining these. So I'm going to slip this. Just to show you what you then might do. So from your database and from the census data, you'll first identify who is poor, the dark gray circle, using the national specifications or the anchor measure specifications from the survey data. And then you'll use the census data to try to figure out how to make the best possible proxy. And you'll compare different specifications in terms of the indicators included, their weights, the deprivation cutoffs, and the poverty cutoffs to try to maximize the overlap. This is from a paper with Schumann, where we looked at different measures that were already under discussion and also proposed another one. So that's the basic idea. That's, I think, all you need to know to just start to think about it. And then 3 closing considerations. One is the number of census indicators you have. You may want to say it would be lovely if there were just 6 of them, because then the journalists would say, you know, who is poor? You are you're a beneficiary for this program if you're deprived in 2 out of these 6 things. And it's very, very clear. But technically, if you have 6 indicators and you need to identify, let's say, 20% of people as being poor in this particular community, then if it's 2 out of 6, 31% of people are poor. If it's 3 out of 6, 11% of people are poor. So there's this big step, a bunching problem, if you're using equal weights in a counting-based measure. So there's some considerations. If there are equal weights which are appealing in terms of transparency, you need more indicators perhaps. Otherwise, you need other ways of combining them to create more, in a sense, diversity in deprivation scores. So remember, early on when I gave the example of you could have a cutoff of 21%, 33%, or 40%, and they'd all identify the same people as poor. That's an example of a bunching problem, which you wouldn't necessarily want in a census measure, where you are going to have to match some level of poverty from the anchor measure. So the second criteria is, in a sense, how do you then set the poverty cutoff? So you have identified people who are poor, or at least identified deprivation scores of people. But then in each region or in each province, you may have a number of people that you have to identify as poor. And so that, in a sense, is setting a K to reflect the number of people that the resources cover or that should be identified as poor. For example, again, in India, they were using the income poverty line of the state. So the percentage of people, and thus the number of people who were income poor, to fix the cap on the number of people who could be identified as below the poverty line using census data appropriately combined. And so effectively, it might be that different regions would use different poverty cutoffs in order to match this exogenous number of poor people that can be identified. And also, clearly the cap of income poverty was not the same as MPI in this example. And so we did propose perhaps considering a different cap at the state level. It only made a huge difference for a few states, but still those people in those states might have that in interest. So this has just been a little taster on targeting. It has distinct challenges from things we've discussed, primarily because of the data source, but also the need to think through the incentives that people have to respond to or accurately answer your questionnaire, and then the problems of leakage and undercoverage, which is what you're trying to minimize. And the other thing to say without going into the literature is that it is measurement design that matters. And whether it's in proxy means tests or in multidimensional work, how you actually design the measure, and you'll see it yourself, clearly influences the leakage and undercoverage errors. And so there's a lot of scope for improving targeting by more attention to the measurement methodologies that are used. And Shuman in my paper also implement a number of proposed methodologies and show this difference in the context of India. And the number of indicators and the particular cutoff that is used are also considerations. So not only identifying who is poor, but then coming back to think of the level of poverty, because it may not be the same. The accuracy may be greater if you use different poverty cutoffs for different regions. So that's a brief introduction, and I'll turn it over to Anna to work in more depth through impact evaluation. Yes, Maimona.
On this methodology, we use it to target really directly a household or a person. Yeah. Because in our countries, in my country at least, the reality is completely different, because we do poverty evaluations, but the targeting has been more from a more general, more broad. Yeah. Yes. But for individual targeting, the dimensions are completely different, and it's mostly based from administrative criteria. I mean, it is what is called vulnerable. I mean, it's poor, but is not able to work or cannot. Yeah, it's something like destitute. So what they do is to go to households or ask the heads of household, how do you say, the administrative representation at local level. They ask him to help identify those persons who are in those situations, like a single mother with 4 children and no employment, for instance. So it is based on that is targeting. So I'm trying to make a connection with this methodology. So maybe when we produce our MPI, we can also try to adjust for those criteria used administratively. I'm trying to think how it would work.
Yeah, so geographic targeting is also very common. I think they showed you the maps of Colombia where 11 of the 15 indicators of their national MPI are present in their census. So using the census, they develop poverty maps, and you guys learned mapping, down to the municipal level. And then they do geographic targeting based on the MPI of the municipality. So that is common and that's easy, although again, it's only 11 of the 15 indicators. So there's again a slightly different MPI, which is used for the geographic targeting. But in the case of household targeting, that's a different approach because you're using the judgment of the local administrators, and I'm very glad that they're so honest and really caring, because sometimes, I think in other places, the problem is that they wouldn't necessarily accurately identify the poor, which is why you...
Someone who's identified as poor and is not.
Yeah,
just
yeah.
again, the subsidy.
Yeah, yeah.
I think really on the impact evaluation side, yes, I agree that quantitative methods would be very helpful, particularly surveys. But in targeting, as Maimuna said, most of our countries, you have a threshold of the people that are poor, but it's in composite form. It can really show also the variations by regions, that this region is the poorest, that. One advantage, what we've been doing is really we target, because it's difficult really to individually identify the households, we target through services. Great. That's what we used to do. Few years ago I went to India and I looked at the poverty alleviation program in India. One of the main differences that I saw in India that most African countries don't have, in each village, or is it para something, Punjab, they have a list of all the households that should benefit from the poverty alleviation program. They can individually identify them. And it's posted at a central place in each community. So everybody knows that these are the households that should benefit from this. We don't have that. Basically, because it was based on earlier literature in poverty, that if the difference between the poor and the non-poor is not more than 5 times, any service that you provide will benefit the poor. But if it is greater than 5 times, then definitely you have to single out the poor and give them special preference. So one advantage I saw really from the multidimensional poverty index here that I've learned is it's going to be very helpful in targeting. It's not only targeting the regions, but even if on the service provision, now you can know that this very region is deprived in education, is deprived in health, is deprived in this thing, which earlier measures couldn't do. So then now what you need to really strengthen is access, quality, and relevance of those services to ensure that everybody in that society has that. Then you will target the poor. Okay.
Thank you so much. And in a sense that I would have a preference for geographic targeting of services, because then it is universal, and then there's no problem of leakage or undercoverage, because hopefully everyone has access. Last one, and then I want to give Anna full time.
There are 2 issues I want us to look at here. First is the time lag between the computation of MPI and then the formulation of the program for targeting, because that might distort the proportion which you have computed in MPI before the target starts. The other one is this issue of geographic targeting and individual household. I've not seen, except maybe this example given, most of the targeting, I've not seen anyone that focus on individual person or household, because usually it's a broad-based intervention that usually come up. And if you want to talk about targeting a particular household on individual basis, then we need to look at the Statistics Act, the issue of confidentiality. When you are collecting data, you have informed the household that this information will not be referred to anybody, to just be used for analysis purposes. Now you now give the list and the household their particulars for them to go and meet them for intervention. So we need to look at that area too.
Good points, and two observations. One is, the individual and household level targeting really came up a lot with the conditional cash transfer programs and with food distribution programs. So those have been the two sort of motors of demand for individual and household level targeting. As I said, geographic targeting with universal services it has many benefits because it's also expensive to target, expensive to do a census, and you make mistakes. And so the universal programs might be a better investment of funds. So I'm not advocating individual or household targeting. I'm simply saying that when they are done, the errors right now are so large that they can be made smaller. And then in terms of in the India Socioeconomic Caste Survey, which is the one used for targeting, people know that it will be used to identify the BPL households. They can opt out if they wish. And also, for example, Indonesia has a survey that only covers the bottom 40% of their population, but the respondents know that it will be used for targeting. So you are correct that in order to use that data for targeting, the informed consent which is provided has to include that fact. Yeah. In terms of the time lag, now with being able to upload the census data regularly, it's not so much of a problem because it can be done relatively quickly because the data cleaning can be simultaneous to ongoing surveys.
Good morning. Thank you. What I'm going to talk about now is using the Alkire Foster methodology in impact evaluation. Please note that this is work in progress. So I'm mostly sharing an idea that we've been thinking about. So it's nothing written in stone. It's just an idea which we are still reflecting if it might work or not. So any feedback is very welcome. The motivation. So the first thing I think we all agree, that poverty is multidimensional. It's no longer debatable. So we agree. Following that, lots of policy interventions have started implementing multisectoral approaches. The idea is that tackling different deprivations at the same time, simultaneously, we might draw on the synergies between those different areas of interventions and enhance the effectiveness of these interventions. So instead of just acting on health, we act on health and schooling, on health, on education, and we hope that the final effect is bigger. An example, it's the conditional cash transfers. So it's investment on human capital by investing simultaneously in making people going to school, people being well with good nutrition, and attending health talks and having regular checkups. Or the Millennium Development Villages. So there it's like an integrated intervention in a village to several sectors to try to make the village come out of poverty traps. So we are moving towards a multisectoral type of policies. At the same time, there is this trend, strong, to assess what we are doing. So before, a couple of decades ago, people would do policy interventions and not very accurately measure what is the final impact of those interventions. But now we think, no, if you are investing our money, there's two things. We have to learn. So if you are doing interventions, it's good that we learn from what we do. So we build this body of knowledge about what it works and what does not work. At the same time, it's connected, we have to see that we are if it's cost effective. So we are putting money on interventions. Let's see what are we getting out of it. So it's an accountability tool at the end of the project. So at the end of the project, normally now there is this demand. Let's see if we are doing something positive or not, or as positive as we would like. So it seems, and if the policies are becoming these multisectoral approaches, it seems natural also that the impact evaluation should also have a multidimensional approach. Maybe, let's see. So the purpose of here is to show how the Alkire Foster methodology could be used in impact evaluation, and I have this empirical application that it's still also very work in progress. The background, there is already, and Sabina mentioned, a literature on, there was a slide already with a list of the papers that I've already working on multidimensional targeting. As far as I know, there is only one that has actually developed the idea of impact evaluation, and that was Romano and Smith. In the same paper, they talk about targeting and multidimensional impact evaluation in Bangladesh of a program of BRAC. And what they say, actually, it's very similar to what I'm saying here, but they see the core idea. I'm having other types of analysis that you could also do, but the core idea in the end is very similar. Why use the Alkire Foster methodology? And this is like an important thing. Why? If the program, well, the first thing that comes is like, if the program is multidimensional, let's have a multidimensional measure as well. Seems more direct. Although it's a multidimensional, it still can allows you to monitor specifically. So you can still go to the incidence of the deprivations, but in addition to that, you see the joint. And what do I mean, like trying to think about how can I say this in an example? So for instance, I have this policy intervention that tries to decrease deprivations in nutrition, education, and housing conditions. And I might go and try to measure the impact in the different, I have indicators, and I try to measure the impact on the different indicators. And I find positive average treatment effects in the different indicators. So it seems the intervention has improved the people's lives. What this adds is that I can see by the level of deprivations of people. Because it might be that the people who actually had improvements in nutrition are not the same that are in sanitation. And so I'm measuring positive, which is good, so the improvements have been made, but I might not be making improvements on the households where they have more deprivations. So this is the idea. When you measure separate, you don't know which people are benefiting. So it might be the people that actually only have that deprivation. When you bring this together, you can start seeing by the level of deprivations of that people had at the start, what was the impact. So that's where we are aiming at with applying this measure to this. This is the core. After this is like, what can we do, what can you show? But this is the core idea, which unfortunately in the application it's not very clear. I have to improve on that. And then it's also an issue of communication. So if you have these these policies that go lots of things, and you're gonna see, because I have here what I did for Oportunidades, there is several papers that say what did work, what didn't work, awesome. But in the end, when you want to sell and say like, oh, this is worked, having an idea to sell or to show to the public, having a number that tells the poverty reduced on this amount, it's also a strong message. So how does this work? And this is straightforward in the sense, it's just think about your MPI, but addressing a question, a policy. So suppose they have a policy reduction program with the objectives. In my case before, it was reducing, improving nutrition, improving housing conditions, and improving education. They have to be a little bit more objective than this. Then you can, each objective can be defined in terms of a minimum threshold of achievement. So if I want to reduce poverty, I want to make sure that there are no children undernourished. And so that is my minimum threshold. There are no children in the household undernourished. So that's the objective. What is this? It's a deprivation indicator, basically. Then I might also have objectives with different importance. So for me, maybe nutrition is more important than housing. Easy. I just give them different weights based on my policy priorities. And then in the end, maybe I can define the overall goal as a minimum of simultaneous deprivations that people can have. It can be 0. I can go for a union approach. Union approach, I think. It can be 0. So I can make sure that no household even is missing one of the objectives. But it can be something in the middle. It might be like, okay, if I have these 5 objectives, if in the household one objective is not being met, I'm not going to worry too much about it, because mostly they are fine. So basically it's only translate that into a K, into a poverty cutoff. Oops, I jumped something. Oh, and of course, this is impact evaluation requires data. So this is only if you have information for the beneficiaries and for a control group. And here, the control group is the big issue. But that's in the literature of impact evaluation. You have to have a comparable control group. Otherwise, the problems of bias selection can go whatever. So in these circumstances, when you can define your policy, in terms of those parameters, you can just translate it to an M0. Where you have the objectives, you can have the or more indicators. So for an objective, you might have more than one indicator. You have Z minimum thresholds, my poverty cutoffs. Like I want every children to have more than attending school, for instance. So you know this. And you have this K. So if you tolerate that the household has 1 or 2 deprivations out of all that you are trying to tackle. And this you already know. So how do you use? You do an identification of the poor, of the people who are missing the objectives based on the dual cutoffs by indicator, then you decay, and you have an M0. This all you know. What's very important for what I'm also showing next is the property of decomposability. So you can go by groups and identify the impact by groups. And then in the end, the idea is just this. So you, instead of using nutrition, education, sanitation as an outcome of interest, I'm not saying instead, but as a complement, you use it as the M0 or the H. So you look at this at the outcome of interest. So you just compute it for the control and the treated groups, and you compare. You test the difference. Just that, normal standard impact evaluation analysis. You can also do it with the raw and censored, uncensored and censored head counts. So you can also go and look to the specific impact in the society or overall on nutrition. And you can also test the impact on the weighted number of deprivations. So looking at the M0 and the H, you can look at that. But in addition, you also have the deprivation score of the society. So you can also see the impact on that before the identification. So in this case, you are not just looking to the people who have missed a number of objectives, but you can see if in the society overall, the number of deprivation has reduced significantly. If you have panel data, you can then also use difference in differences, like normally. Instead of just computing means, you can have a regression where you can control for other variables. And when you have when you have this panel data, you can also do other kind of play with the data. You can assess the comparability of the 2 groups in terms of the deprivations at the baseline. Normally we do it in terms of characteristics when we want to see if the groups are comparable, the control and the treatment. We can do it in number of deprivations. You can look at the impacts on probabilities of transition. You can decompose what we talked 2 days ago, the change in M0 over time, that Sabina talked on when you have panel data, between movements in and out of poverty, or if you are reducing the deprivations of people that still are not out of the scope of your attention, but have they improved? And then you can do the decomposition across geographical areas and population groups to see if you are having a positive, suppose you are having an impact, but is your impact targeting certain groups, like some ethnic groups? Is the effect on these ethnic groups stronger or less strong than in the average population? This kind of analysis. Now let's go to the empiric application. Why oportunidades? And this is very, I have lots of nice things, but it's because the data is available. And so honestly, it's not the best, because in the end, I don't think it's showing exactly what I would like to show. So in the end, I might use an illustration first with values to show this idea that you can go and see the impact on the poorest. But for now, this is the data that we have. It was the pioneer in conditional cash transfers, a huge program, very important. There's been a landmark after this, conditional cash transfers became the thing to do. It's a multisectoral program, so it tries to tackle these poverty traps in a multidimensional way. They give, most of you probably know, sure, they give educational grants conditional on kids attending school. So if kids have to attend school, a certain percentage of the classes or the households lose the grants. They make another condition, mothers have to attend regular talks. And kids under a certain age also have to have regular checkups. In nutrition, they give actually, and this is unconditional, a grant and also some vitamins for a grant of money so households can buy better food. But the wonderful thing of this is also, and that's why one of the reasons why I become so, it's the issue of impact evaluation. Since the beginning, they were very concerned about making sure that the program would be properly assessed. So not just doing it, but doing it and know in the end if what we're doing is being effective. And so for that, they did they had an experimental design. This in the rural areas when it started. They identified what were the villages where they were going to implement it, but they could not do it at the same time. There was no budget budget conditions, logistics to go at the same time in all the locations. So what they did, they randomized the starting. So first, we're going to start in these villages. In 3 years, we go to all the village that we know. And by randomizing this and then collecting data, they have a treated group and a control group that made that possible. Lots of analysis of how this policy has impacted on people's lives. Also the data collected before and after, so you can have panel data. And as I said before, in the literature there is long list of analysis of the different impacts of oportunidades, positive impact on enrollment, no impact on school attendance. So people actually apparently are going more to, kids are registering in school, but that doesn't mean they are attending school classes more. Reduction in school grade gaps. So kids are passing the school grade complete. There is negative impact on the probability of illness of children under 5. So the health of kids seems to be improved. Negative impact on children's labor. That actually was also one of their main ideas. It's taking kids out of school to reduce the opportunity costs of kids going to school by giving these cash transfers, and increase in food expenditure. So this is what has been said when you look to each program individually, each indicator individually, sorry. So what I did, it was to try to select an indicators so I'm going to I created an M0 to assess the impact of opportunities. So I select indicators that would reflect the minimum goals of the program. This is my interpretation of the minimum goals of the program, I look to the indicators where they have looked to the impact, so based on literature. And in this case, I also made this limitation because I wanted to look at the panel as a panel data, and so I looked to indicators that were available in all time periods, and that was a big restriction. So I might change and instead of looking to all periods, look to 2 periods just to have more indicators. But for now, this is what I did, and select weights. We did. List of indicators. So these were the indicators that I come up to. Enrollment. At least one household is deprived. It's at least one member between 6 and 14 is not attending school. School attendance. If the household is deprived, if they are not enrolled, or if they have attended less than 90% days of schooling. No child labor, so no household member, if at least one household member is aged 8 to 14 is working, even if unpaid, the household is deprived. Children's health, it was if a child between 0 and 2 was ill in the past 4 weeks for more than 5 days. And the health visits for monitoring, for nutrition monitoring. That was also one that was associated with the program. So if one of the children between 0 and 2 has not gone to the health center in the past 6 months. So this was like in the info indicators that were available, and more or less they were connected with what the program was trying to do. Problems and the weights. I started with yes, let's give weights, equal weights to everything. When I go to see the association, and it's clear by the definition, there is like the education indicators, the overlap is really big. Just because the second you have to be already deprived in the first to be, or no, if you are deprived on the first, you are automatically in the second. So the second is only getting to a little additional step on the deprivations. So there was a big correlation. So if I put both with the same weight, what happens? I'm double accounting for lots of households that yes, of course, if they don't have the child in school, they also don't have it attended. So I'm doubling. By giving it the same weight, I'm increasing the deprivation of those households. So in the end, what I decided to do, it was give it the half weight. So those two indicators are measuring one of the others, one deprivation. So in the end, that was what we did. Still, there is a big problem with all these indicators. Anyone can see what could bias this. What is the problem? And we talk about this, of all these indicators. Exactly, it has to do, these indicators are all connected with children, and children in different age brackets. So what happens is that, as they are defined with reference to children, the poverty status of the household is very dependent on the demographic structure of the household. But the program was targeting mostly children, so, but I also have children in different brackets, so it's not ideal, it's difficult. Sorry? But even if they didn't have children, they could have still the nutrition. Actually, they could still be beneficiaries. So I can eliminate them and just don't look at them, but then I'm not also assessing them. It's a problem. It's a problem. There is not other way around it. Sample size. Now I'm going to go a bit more. Sample size. It's a big sample. It's a big sample. This is a big. There is attrition. Like it's a panel. If I want to keep everybody, so I start the first two. It's the baseline, and then every 6 months there was a new survey. You can see on the your right columns the attrition rates, which were considerable. But for my purpose, I'm worried, but not as worried, because if you see they are relatively similar across control and treated groups. And so what I'm concerned here is to see the comparability and to see when I make the difference, I'm actually measuring an impact. Differences, so what I can start to do is look at the baseline. Let's see if the two groups were comparable or not. First thing, I look at the raw head counts at the baseline. Red is the control group, the blue is the treated group. And although they are not exactly the same, the difference is not statistically significant. So there was no statistically significant differences in the deprivations at the baseline. I also looked at head count, H, and the M0 at the baseline. Red is again the control, green is the treatment, and the dashed is the confidence intervals. And you see they mostly overlap. So no significant difference there either. For different case. So I'm looking for a case from 0.25 to 1, no differences. Normalized weights, yeah. Differences at the baseline on censored head counts, assuming a K equals to 0.25, but I've done for other cases as well. And again, no significant differences. You see that the treated as an M0 a little bit bigger, but it's not a statistical difference. Those is the contributions, the censored head counts and the contributions by absolute contribution. So it's not in percentage, because you see that there is a difference on the height, but the absolute contributions of each indicator and no significant differences. Finally, I look at the distribution of the deprivations at the baseline. So this is like the pie are the size of the treated group and the control group, and each slice is the percentage of people that have a deprivation share within a certain interval. So what you can see from the first one is that actually my measure, according to my measure, there are lots of people who are eligible, but they actually are not even considered, they have 0 deprivations in my indicators. Which means that actually what I'm looking, what they use to target, it's not exactly what I'm measuring here. Because according to my measure, the blue share is of households that have no deprivation. But you see, but the point here is like, again, the percentage of the slices are similar across the two groups. That's the point for the example. For the other, it's like, yes, the indicators here, there is something that it's not perfect. Impact. So what we do, and this is using only cross-section. It's easy. What we do, we just go to the period 1, and we compare the H and the M0 of control and treated groups. And I did it here for several cases. Let's see if changes. And you can see it's now there are significant differences. And I think that's when K is below 0.75. So for any K below 0.75, both the H and the M0 among the treated group is lower. So in the we started with no difference, but after, and this is actually a pretty short period if you think it's 6 months, there was a decrease, a reduction on the deprivations of the, was a reduction on the poor, on those that are missing. Good news. You can also do time series. So I can see, instead of seeing in levels, I can look to the change. And in this case, it's the absolute change. See how the difference, so how much did the treated group has reduced M0, comparing how much the control group has reduced M0. And you again see that for any K below 0.75, there was the amount of reduction in the treatment group was much bigger than in the control group. And you can do this for the across time. So what is now, and this is interesting also because you can. So this is after one period for every K. Here I fix the K. I fix the 0.25. So like suppose that the K, I want to reduce the deprivation, the share of deprivations of households below 25%. And I have now on periods, and I see the reduction, the head count of both groups along the periods. And what is interesting here is that the big reduction, so the big impact of the program, occurs in the first period. So if you see, it's a big drop. They start almost the same, because as I said before, they were comparable, apparently. But then as the program starts, there is a big reduction on the deprivation, on the M0 and the H, not on the deprivations, I'm not on, of the control group. But after that, of the control group, no, of the treated group. But after that, it goes much smoother. And if you look at the M0, actually the control group seems to be catching up. So, I don't know how. My guess is that the impact of the program is coming, when I assess with my indicators, mostly through the conditionality. Once you enter in the program, families go and put their kids into school, enroll them, and they start going to school. And so there is a big impact in the first period. But once that happens, the rest seems to be more or less fine. So that's my guess. This is for different cases, like in different times. You can see as the time goes on, the impacts are lower, but they are still above 50. I still have significant impacts. I could look, as I said, I could also look at the deprivations count. So here, it's all the population, it's before identification, and I'm just saying, looking at the share of deprivations. And again, it's the same, similar pattern. So the share falls after the first period. While for the control group, there is good things going on because they are going down, but not, they have like the same level at the first. Then, what you can do, this was the M0 and the H, so I was looking at the impact on the aggregate measures. But then I can go and see by indicator itself. Let's see the impact on the ROEV counts. And the first top left is at the baseline that I had already showed before. And then it's after each year. And what you can see again on the first year is that, yes, there is a reduction on the education. So the biggest reduction seems to be on the education indicators, although there is also on the children's checkups. On the second, there is and this was seen, I wish I don't have an explanation, there was a worsening of the conditions when you look just to the indicators, then on the third period again. And on the third period, actually the other indicators are not statistically significant. So the big effect remains on the education. It was that the education dropped, and after that, the other ones didn't. You can look at, this was the raw counts. So no, this is the censored. So this is the population as a general. You should look at both. But here, it's just the censored. And when you just look at the poor, it's the education. The difference in education remains. It's that gap that once you fall, they go both more or less parallel. Look, you can look at the impact of probabilities on the probabilities of transition out and into poverty. And what I saw here, it's yes, the program, like the probability of out of poverty is always bigger for the treated group, and into poverty is always bigger for the control group. So it seems that yes, it's making people get out of poverty and avoiding people getting into poverty. And this is also what I need to improve, because I did this decomposition a while ago, and I actually didn't take advantage that I had panel data. So actually, most of these will be with Shapley. But forget about that. This is the Shapley. Here we can do what Sabina showed with the panel data, and precise. As I have panel data, I can go exactly and see how much of my reduction on the deprivations in each group have to do with movements in and out of poverty, or the intensity of those that remain poor. But better than that, you can decompose this by groups. And so here I have non-indigenous and indigenous in both control and treated areas. And so by comparing, that's a property of the M0, but now you can compare in the indigenous group if the effect was bigger or smaller than across the average, than across the population of the other groups. And so you can just compare the absolute variations. Make the difference, and then you know the impact on that specific group. And the same for non-indigenous. And what is interesting in this is actually there was a big impact on the indigenous, because in the control group, the level of poverty among the indigenous actually increased. Not significant, but increased, while in the treated group decreased. So that's the kind of analysis that you can do. You can do it by family structure, and for me it was important, and I have not yet finished here, but because my indicators are so prone to my indicators are so focused on age groups that my results depend. How much you are poor depends on that. So in the end, there is lots of other things that I still have to do, but this is just to put that the idea that this is a possibility, and the final is that. What I think it's the added value is what I said earlier. When you look at the indicators separately, you don't know which part of the distribution of people you are looking at. So my increase is on people that only have one deprivation. But when you look at them together with this M0, you might focus selecting a K, or looking for the different case, you might focus exactly on people that have more deprivations than others, if that the goal is taking them out of poverty. But this was it. Very simple, the idea. Okay, just the idea. Any questions, any comments? No. I don't know. Sabina wants to talk about the site. Oh, there is like, I didn't see any back.
Just yeah, just two questions. There is also an institute called the 3IE, International Initiatives for Impact Evaluation, based in Washington, D.C. and New Delhi. And I think there is also office in London, which is working rigorously on impact evaluation. And I want to know if the AF impact evaluation method is really different from the 3IE method. The second question is, when you analyze impact evaluation, usually there are treatment and control groups. And there are problems of capturing the spillover effects. For example, you want to really look at the impact of a certain program into different regions. And you have got treatment and control groups. And we may not be really sure whether the program being undertaken in a treatment group could also be transferred into the control groups. And my question here is, does the AF method have developed controlling the spillover effects of the program?
So my answers are not very good to this. So to the first question, of the center you mentioned. I actually don't know the center, but I doubt that the methodology of impact evaluation is different. Because what I'm doing here, I'm not proposing anything really new to the impact evaluation techniques. I'm just making a contribution in terms of measurement. So everything else that you learn and that other big groups that work in impact evaluation, like I think JPAL, do, it will still be needed to be done here. So I don't have like oh, I'm sure that there will be no problems of what spillovers. Oh, I'm sure that the groups will be comparable. No, that I cannot. That I don't have a magic bullet for that. So the technique is the same. What I'm proposing is just a new measure. Is instead of you look to the impact in different measures, you look to the impact on this aggregated measure. So that's what I'm thinking. I'm proposing and I'm thinking, we are thinking, but so it's not on the technique itself. And so because of that, because I don't have, I wish I had, I would become a millionaire if I had something better to add to the methodology of impact evaluation, the problems that you have in terms of spillovers still apply. And that is more, it's not connected. It's the biggest, it has to do with the type of intervention that you have. So there are more interventions that have are more prone to have spillovers than others, and so that the problem still stands, because I'm just talking about the measure. The technique that we could use is the same. So no good answers for that. So if no other questions, maybe we could talk a little bit of the website. Sabina, would you want to talk about the website or? Okay.
Okay. So first, I'd like to introduce Claire, who's in the back. Claire will be our incoming Research Communications Officer of OPHI. She started on the 20th of October. So she's getting a sense by meeting you all. So I do hope that you talk with her. But she will also be working on the website and inputting, making changes and streamlining it in very interesting ways. But I wanted to show you just how to do some basics that I mentioned yesterday on downloading the data sets, for example, for the global MPI and your country brief. And then if you want to make PowerPoints sort of to teach how to get some of the images to do that. So this is our website, and you want to go to global MPI. But then it's a bit of a trick question. You then don't want to click again on global MPI, because that takes you somewhere else. You want to click on Global MPI 2014. That's the easiest way to find the materials for this year. Then you'll see this little menu that says you can select immediately the country briefings, the data tables, the case studies, the methodology, and the infographics. So, oops, sorry. The same, if you just click on the Global MPI 2014 page, these are all at the top of the page. So what you first might be interested in are the data tables. And these are Excel files which come in 4 sets. The first have the national MPI results, as well as the dimensional information and information from other data sources for the same country. So here you will find the population, the percentage of people who are $1.25 a day poor, $2 a day poor, poor by the national poverty line. You'll find HDI levels and values. You'll find the region of the country, and then obviously the HA and M0 of the country. But you'll also see the censored headcount ratios and the contributions of the indicators. And you'll see the percentage of people who are destitute and those who are vulnerable because their deprivation score is between 20 and 33%, or severely poor because their deprivation score exceeds 50%. So that's all in this first Excel chart. The second has that information by rural and urban for all countries, or for 106 of the 108 countries. We don't have decompositions for Argentina and China. So if you're interested particularly in rural urban, in the composition of poverty and all of that, then please go to those tables 3.1 to 4.3. The subnational decompositions are in tables 5, and the changes over time are in changes 6. For example, if you want to look at all regions of your country, then you would want to download the subnational file. And then you can put that into other data sources, but that's where you'll find the Excel tables. It stopped. So that's the data tables. The country briefings have for each country a PDF which summarizes the information for the country, which is quite useful if you just need something to print out quickly, or if you want students to do country comparisons or whatever if you're teaching. Those are quick ways of summarizing the data in an intuitive way. And then our interactive data bank also has both country and international data. So you can access it from the country briefing page, but you can also access it through the interactive data bank page. And both of them lead you to the same place, which is here. And what you do is, this is, the base page is the head count or proportion of people who are multidimensionally poor. The scale is always in the bottom. But you can also scroll down to see other things. So for example, call out a country, somebody. Mali, right? Is that what you said? So this is the head count of Mali as a map. If you scroll over it, you'll get the percentage of people who are multidimensionally poor in each region. If you hit graph, then you will have the graph where Mali's entry is in gray and indicated, and you can see the head count of people who are multidimensionally poor and the head count of people who are destitute, and the black dot being the head count of people who are income poor on less than $1.25 a day. And you can change this to say, okay, I don't want the black dot to show $1 a day poverty, I want it to show intensity. And I wanted to show national intensity, so there it is. So you can change these in an interactive way depending on what your study is. You may want to look at $2 a day poverty in the countries, and there it is. So, and then any of these you can take pictures of or screenshots if you want to save them for PowerPoints. Scrolling down, you will have the headcount ratios of MPI for each region, and then you'll have, in a sense, the same information as is in the country briefing. So the overview, the survey that was used and the date, the MPI H and A, the vulnerability and severe poverty, and inequality among the poor, so those results. And then those results by rural and urban areas. And then the censored headcounts of rural and urban areas, as well as national censored headcounts for each of the 10 indicators. The censored headcounts here are also presented in the more, and you can do it either total or you can do it urban and rural and see both of them to be able to compare the censored headcounts for urban and rural regions. And then you can also look at urban and rural contributions to poverty, either in absolute, and in absolute, the height of the bar is the value of the MPI for rural and urban regions. But you also might want to look at the percentage contribution, so they all add up to 100%. So you can select what you want, and again, take pictures as you need. And you have that information by subnational region. You have, this is quite important, this is the intensity band. So everybody whose deprivation score is between 33% and 39.9% is here. And it's 11% of all poor people in Mali have very low deprivation scores. But you see 8% of all poor people in Mali have a deprivation score that's above 90%. So it's quite useful to look at the intensity, the bands of intensity among the poor. And then for countries where we have trends over time, there is this graphic, but it doesn't work very well. So for trends over time, I would commend to you the data files on trends over time at this point. So this is available for all of the 108 countries, as well as for all countries together. If you don't select a country, it shows all of them. And under methodology, you have, in a sense, the methodological note, how it was constructed. And if you're interested in a particular country and how we treated the nutrition subsample in Ethiopia, for example, then you can go and there'll be notes in the methodological note about those details. Finally, if you go to the resources page, those are the soft copies of the briefings that you've had in the coffee area this week. So, and there are additional ones that we don't have printed. So we have a briefing that just gives a 2-page overview of all findings, an 8-page overview of all findings, and that's what you've had available. But there are also briefings online, one on urban-rural poverty, one on destitution, and one on changes over time. And you can download those here. If you want to read our papers, we'd love you to read our papers and to give us comments. Then they are also linked directly from here, the background papers to the 3 special studies this year on rural-urban poverty, destitution, and inequality among the poor. Sorry, we also have, I should have said it, a briefing on inequality among the poor. The press releases that we've had are also there for different regions. So you might want to look at the press release for or briefing on results in different regions. And finally, through Mexica's dedicated work, we have our first set of infographics, which are trying to really simplify the methodology. So for your teenager or for your mother, the person that John Hammock said you need to communicate MPI poverty to, you can see if these work. This is a new area for us, so we'd be interested in any feedback that you have. And sorry, it's not loading. But they are downloadable. And basically take a person called Le from Indonesia, look at her poverty for the MPI, or in the case of destitution, look at Aruna. And so start with one individual and then try very, very lightly to give non-technical people or children or youth a sense of what this work is about. So those are the resources on our webpage. We're interested in your feedback, but we're also interested in really your making use of them and using them. For quantitative work, you can download your subnational data and use it in your macro panel regressions that Bubo was speaking about yesterday, fixed effect models. You can do maps from these data here using the particular configuration of indicators that you want. So that's what some people had requested knowing about, and this is where it is. And yep.
Do you have the MPI survey questionnaire?
The what?
MPI survey questionnaire.
That's a good point. We have it. Mejika has pulled out and formatted the questions. I don't think it's there. I'm happy to email it, and we should put it up. We have it. So what we have is 2 forms of the MPI questionnaire. DHS questionnaires have 625 questions. MPI uses 39 of those questions. So one version is, in a sense, the version for National Statistics Offices, and it has the questions from DHS and MIX, and where they're different, we have both of them, so that you can see precisely what they use. But in other cases, an NGO or a student may want a quicker or lighter version. For example, instead of getting education on the household roster, asking if any adult in the household, anybody over 10, anybody at all, has 5 years of schooling. So we have a light form of the MPI questionnaire, and the difficulty with that is what you do about the malnutrition questions, but the rest can be done in very simple ways. So I will send it to Tash to send to the class. Yeah? Cool. But yeah, we should put it on the website. You're accurate. Anything else? Okay, it's now coffee break. For 11 o'clock, you'll come back. Thank you.